Hey Angie,
How are you?
good. How are you? I see
Good.
Annie. Annie, you already had a sneak peek.
Oh yeah, I'm excited.
I don't know if you guys want to give it a couple of minutes since it's level two. Jess, is this now your title by default?
I guess.
I think we have a few people already, so I think we can just get started. So I like had to check the time of the day to just make sure it was good afternoon versus good morning. But good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. We are going to talk about buying a home and walk you through the process of it. We won't get through the entire process today because this is super content heavy. And so our goal is to make this as simple and easy to understand as possible. So we want to go through a little bit of context first as to why this is important to alternatives to talk about. And so Deanna, if you can go to the first slide. So I think we all here know that there is a history of racism in home ownership in the US and in Chicago. And so it originally came, I shouldn't say it originally, let me not say that. But one of the big things that impacted home ownership was redlining. And so that is the idea. You can see the map in which certain neighborhoods were color coded based on their risk, and those that were coded as red were not given resources, were not given loans, and people were steered away from. So the history of racism is much more complicated than this. This is just a quick overview of some of the things that have happened and the impact. And so what this has done historically is drive down value for homes in neighborhoods of color, drive down investment, and make it really difficult for Black and Brown folks to own. And today, 11 million Americans live in formerly redline areas, of which about half live in these 10 major cities, which one is Chicago. And so this is seen as contributing to the segregation that we see today in all of these cities. Next slide. And so with that being said, this continues today. And some quick stats that I want to highlight is that 13% of Black home shoppers were rejected for a mortgage loan last year, in contrast with 4% of Latinx and 5% of white shoppers. And one of the major issues was the debt to income ratio. Black families tend to hold more debt and have less generational wealth. And when borrowing money, there was a higher cost of loans for Black individuals and families. And that's a lot of around the interest rate in particular. And they often paid 3 times more for their loans in comparison to white borrowers. And so what we're hoping to do today is kind of give you some of the information to prep up front so that you know what some of these things are as you go through your home buying process. Next slide. Okay, so the first piece is qualifying for a home loan. This is unless you're going to buy your house in cash, which I feel like I'll speak for myself. I would not be able to. The rest of us hope to get a loan. And so this process is a lot more complicated than folks will lead you to believe. And that's going to be the first thing that we walk through is how do you qualify for a home loan? And so we are looking at payment affordability, debt to income ratio, credit score, down payment, savings, and employment history. And so a lot of the more complicated stuff comes in the debt to income ratio and credit score. Those are going to be huge factors. And those are the things that we're going to be walking through. A lot of that is what we're walking through today. Next slide. All right. So math. I'm assuming everybody here loves math, right? So how much can you afford? A rule of thumb that lenders use is that your monthly payment should not be more than 28% of your gross income. So that is your income before taxes. Some lenders will go above 30%. And when we talk about your monthly payment, that includes the principal, which is your mortgage loan, the interest that you're paying on that loan, that property taxes that you have to pay to the city, your home insurance that you have as a requirement for your loan, and your private mortgage insurance, which we'll talk about later. So all of these things need to be under 30% of your monthly income. And so we went ahead and showed you a sample. So we used it, in this case, we used the number 60K because that is the median salary in Chicago. And so if your annual salary is 60K, then your monthly will be 5,000. 28% of that is 1,400, or 30% of that is 1,500. So under what how a lender would view you is if you have no other debt, the max you can pay on a $60,000 salary is $1,500. So also keep in mind that when you're calculating your salary, it's anybody who's going in on that loan with you. So if you're buying with a partner, if you have a co-signer, all of that income is contributing towards. And so your salary may be 60,000, but your partner's is also 60,000. And so together you would have 120K, and you would do this calculation for 120,000. And so it's not just you, it's whoever is signing off on that loan with you. I'll pause, Jessica, to see if you want to add anything to that.
Thanks. No, I think that you covered everything.
Cool. And I mean, y'all feel free to jump in the chat if you have questions, because this is a little bit more tricky. All right. So the other calculation that lenders are going to be looking at is that your debt to income cannot be more than 43%. So these calculations are a little bit different from each other. So when we talk about this 43%, we are talking about your total debt that you have as a person. This is your credit card debt, this is your auto loan, this is your any fixed expense that you may have that cannot be easily removed. And so your cell phone bill doesn't count in there for whatever reason, but it's literally if you have child support payments, anything like that, they're going to calculate it, your student loans and your debt. And so you cannot have more than 43% debt. So what happens if how you figure this out? So basically, when you have a $60,000 salary, again, this number doesn't take into account co-signers, everybody else. It's the same example from last slide. Your monthly debt cannot be more than $2,150, of which that $2,150 is included in that number is the mortgage. Next slide. So what does this look like in practice? This is what this looks like in practice. So you have to take these two numbers and figure out your debt. So if you have your car payment, you have a car, by the way, I took the average numbers for these to figure out what folks typically pay. So car payment, you have your car insurance, you have a credit card monthly payment, a student loan, your total debt is $960. So then you subtract that from the max you are allowed to have, and that $1,190 becomes your, so even though 33% of your income is $1,500, right? 30%, as we talked about in the first slide, because you have all of this debt, it reduces your ability to pay to $1,190. I'm gonna pause to make sure this makes sense, because this is always a little trickier. Feel free to ask questions.
Are this is pre-tax amounts?
Yes,
Okay.
it's pre-tax amounts. And so this is where it gets tricky, because you're like, oh, 30% of my income, that's $2,000 or whatever that may be. But then when you start adding all the stuff, it puts you way over that 43%, and that's not what they're going to let you borrow. And as you saw from the first slide, this is where most folks get their loan rejected. So if you have a cosigner, that goes a really long way towards helping you raise that income if you think you can buy more. Because we all know, right, using the same example of you being allowed to spend $1,200 on housing, we all know that everybody's rent is more than that in Chicago, pretty much. So most of us can afford more than that, but it's proving that to a lender. Next slide. And so finally, on the flip side, if you are trying to figure out how much a home is going to cost you, this is, again, not a rule set in stone. So you figured out how much you can afford, right, per month. And now you're figuring out what is the amount you can afford in a home. So the quickest way to figure that out is the 8.71 rule, which takes into account all of the different things that we just talked about are included in that payment. And you take the total cost of that home and you multiply it by 8.71 and divide it by 12. So for example, if you want to purchase a $250,000 home, you will multiply that by 8.71%, which gives you $21,000 a year. And then you divide that by 12. And so that home would cost $1,800 a month. And so that tells you if your max is $1,200, a $250,000 home would not be affordable. And so you can play with the numbers with your own calculations to get an idea of it. Next slide. Oh, actually, let me say one thing before we keep moving. All of this, that 1814 can change based on your credit score, based on your down payment, because all the other factors, your credit score determines your interest loan payment and it determines your PMI. And your down payment determines your loan amount. So if you have a $250,000 home, but you can put, let's say, $50K on it, then you're actually doing the math on the 200,000, not on the 250. And so that's kind of giving you an idea. So now we can go on to the next slide. All right, Jess, I'm turning this over to you.
Thanks, Bessie. I want to just highlight an illustration before I jump into credit score about kind of what Bessie's talking about. All of the factors that we have gone over today so far, the payment affordability, the debt to income ratio, and then the factors that we're going to go over, which is credit score, down payment, savings, and employment history. All of those work really closely together. They're very interwoven to make the final mortgage calculation. And so each of them is going to impact and affect the others, as Bessie was saying earlier. So I want to dig into the specifics of credit scores next. Generally speaking, you'll need a credit score of at least 620. Now, one thing to note, and we're going to look at screenshots of this in just a minute, but one thing to note is that that credit score is calculated differently from the way that you typically see credit scores calculated. And so just hold that in your mind for a minute, because sometimes people will go into a home buying situation thinking that they have a good credit score for that, and then find out later that they don't. So the higher your credit score, the better. So again, going back to what Bessie was saying, your interest rates and your PMI are going to depend significantly on what your credit score is. And so again, all of these factors kind of come together, impacting each other to develop your final mortgage equation. So the way that you want to actually find out what your credit score is to look at your true actual credit reports through Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. These are the 3 standard credit reporting agencies. You want to use them as your starting point. And though I'm going to put the website in the chat in just a minute, but it's annualcreditreport.com that you want to use. There is a federal rule that you have to have access to your credit score and full credit report once a year from each of those credit unions, credit reporting bureaus. And so that's how you want to do that. There are other websites that will say that they are free. They will say that they have free in the name, but they are not actually the official website. And so that's why I want to make sure that I put that in the chat for you all. An average of all 3 of those scores is usually taken through a special calculation that doesn't show up on standard apps. And so kind of in line with some of the history and the issues with home buying is that a lot of the things that are used to determine your exact mortgage equation are considered like trade secrets, and they don't have to share their exact breakdown with you. But going through those specific credit reports, again, Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax, that will help you to get a solid sense of it because they have to use those official numbers to get their calculation. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Deanna. Thanks. Okay, so this is a screenshot of different credit scores from the same day. So this person, if you look at their Vantage score, that is a specific type of score. It's very high. It's 801, right? So that looks great. Fantastic for a mortgage, way over 620, which is what is needed, right? Then when you break down what's called a FICO score, you have Experian here reporting out the FICO scores as 3 different scores, 759, 821, and 750. And that's in a large part because the credit union or the credit reporting bureaus are all using a different calculation to determine the FICO score. It's a higher standard, and it is still used to determine mortgages. If you were looking to buy other kinds of, or take out other kinds of loans, typically the Vantage score is what is used, but that higher standard of the FICO score, plus a little bit of extra. So if you look down at the very bottom at the screenshot where it says credit cards, auto, mortgages, this is that special calculation of the credit score, FICO score 2 for mortgages specifically, and it's 699. So it's a huge difference between the 801 that we're seeing on the Your Status Ahead under the Vantage score and the actual FICO mortgage score. And I'm going to pause here and see if Bessie wants to add anything while I put this annual credit report website in the chat.
Yeah, so the way that you can get this score is if you go through if you go through any of the bureaus, they will share the other credit scores, as Jessica was saying. So you can see here it has Equifax and TransUnion. But the way to do this, the easiest way I found to do this is to go through Experian. And Experian does this thing where they offer you a 7-day free trial to use all of their services. Sign up for the free trial, and then you can get access to your mortgage score. And as soon as you get it, just cancel it. You don't have to put your credit card down or anything, but it will allow you, and I do this like literally once a month or once every other month to look at my stuff. And you can do it as many times as you want when you're getting ready to buy, just to get an idea of how that number, that mortgage FICO score 2 is moving. And so you can look at all of this stuff for free through Experian.com. So yeah, it's really simple, but most, kind of what Jessica said, trade secrets, most people don't know that this is easily accessible.
Bessie, you can go to the next slide, Deanna. Okay, so we've talked through our first three factors: payment, affordability, debt to income ratio, and credit score. Now we're going to move into down payment. So on your down payment, you want to avoid PMI. PMI is your private mortgage insurance. If you have 20% that you can put down, then you will avoid PMI entirely. For most people, that's not possible. I will speak for myself. It was not possible for me at all. And so that's
Definitely
something,
not possible.
yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. So you more than likely will end up paying PMI. Private mortgage insurance, or PMI, is basically you are paying to ensure the bank that you will not stop paying your mortgage. And the reason that they do that is because they have, the banking industry wants to make sure that they are making solid investments and not losing their money that they're loaning out. And so they're making you pay extra on top of your interest rates and et cetera if you can't
So
pay the 20% down payment.
I just have to say this. So basically, they think that you're too risky to give money to because you don't have enough money. Therefore, they charge you more money
Right.
to not having enough money.
Yes, exactly. Again, everything is very interconnected. And so the more things that are in your favor financially, the more things that are given to you financially in this process of developing a mortgage equation. A lot of unfairness in that. I'll just say that. Okay, so the average annual cost of PMI is typically about 0.58 to 1.86 of the original loan amount. Again, that's impacted by your credit score. So not just your down payment, but also your credit score impacts your PMI. The cost of a private mortgage insurance, or PMI, depends on several factors. The size of the mortgage, the more you borrow, the more you pay, because again, you're quote unquote riskier. How much down payment amount that you have, as we've talked about, your credit score, as we've talked about, and then the type of mortgage. So there's been a lot of stories in the news right now about how high interest rates are. If you have an adjustable rate mortgage, then your interest rate goes up and down with the market. If you have a fixed rate mortgage, then you tend to keep, well, then you more than likely are going to keep the same interest rate. It's not a hard and fast rule, which again is one of those really confusing things about doing mortgages. But generally speaking, those are the ways in which those mortgages are divided up. And because the rate can go up so much with an adjustable rate mortgage, suddenly spiking your monthly mortgage payment, then that loan is riskier than a fixed rate loan. And so they will charge you more PMI for that type of loan. So again, as Betsy was saying, the riskier you are, if they determine that you're too risky to loan money to, they're going to charge you more money, even though they're giving you the money. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Deanna. Thanks. So 20% would be that way to avoid PMI. That being said, down payments can be as low as 3%. You want to pay as much as you can while still having money for closing costs and savings. So the goal really is to save as much towards that 20% as you possibly can, but still give yourself a cushion. When I bought my house last year, I think we did, my husband and I decided to do about half of what we had saved because we wanted to have enough for our down payment. We wanted to have enough for closing costs and then a cushion, which was a very good thing because in the first year of homeownership, we've had a lot of unexpected expenses that we were able to cover because we didn't just drain our accounts entirely. And we did end up paying more for PMI than we would have otherwise, but we decided it was worth it to have that little extra cushion. So here you have also a down payment assistance programs. Sometimes your lender can connect you to those. There's also some resources at the end that we're going to go over that you could utilize as well for down payment assistance. So if you put 5% down, I'm looking at the little chart here on the right-hand side, you will end up paying PMI. If you have 20% for your down payment, then you would not end up paying PMI. And so it breaks it down 17,500 versus having 70,000. Your monthly mortgage payment is $400 a month lower if you're able to put down 70,000 versus 17,500 or $493, actually almost $500 cheaper to put 20% down versus 5% down. So again, that snowball effect of the more money that you have, the better deal that you're gonna get for that. Then we have a monthly payment breakdown and of where that $493 is coming from. With the 5% down, you're paying a higher principal, which makes sense because there's more of the home amount that's getting paid off. When you are paying property tax, though, that's the same. Your homeowner's insurance is the same. And that PMI is a big part of what makes up the rest of that $493 because when you put the 20% down, it's $0 versus $211. Anything to add here, Bessie, around down payments?
Yeah, I think the PMI sounds like a really bad thing. However, it is also based on credit and your debt to income ratio. So if you have no other debt and you have good credit, that number can be lower. So for context, my PMI on a $270,000 loan is $150. And so when I looked at that monthly payment for me was cheaper than rent still. Even paying PMI, my monthly payment's still cheaper than rent. And so like those are the things, a lot of people try to save up 20% to avoid PMI, but it's going to be so difficult for most of us to save that 70K. And so you just kind of have to figure out what the trade-offs are.
Yeah, and Bessie had that exact conversation with me when I was trying to buy a house because I had it in my head that like I just wanted to avoid PMI at all costs. And she was like, "You're never going to buy a house then." I was like, "All right, fair." And what we ended up doing was essentially equivalent to our rent payment. It was a little higher, but it was what our rent would have been raised to. And so I was like, okay, this makes sense. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so we have talked about payment affordability, debt to income ratio, credit score, and down payment. Now we're going to talk about the last two factors in qualifying for a home loan, which is savings and employment history. And so when you are looking to get a mortgage and you're shopping around for different lenders, there's going to be an assessment of what money you actually have. And they're going to be basically looking to see if you lost your income tomorrow or your partner, whoever's on the mortgage, is going to lose your income tomorrow, then they want to see that you have enough money saved to cover at least 2 months of mortgage payments. Because again, they're wanting to make sure that they get their money in the end whenever they are lending out mortgages. People also in the mortgage industry really like to see employment steadiness. And so a lot of that has to do with the same job, the same industry. They want to see at least 2 years of work history. My husband works in non-traditional employment. And so when they were initially doing our pre-approval for our mortgage, they actually didn't include his income because it was just too complicated. In the end, they did for the full mortgage. But when somebody has really complicated employment history or income history, then that means that they are going to dig really deep into it and really want to know a lot of details about that. Basically, they think that the more you've worked in one stable industry that makes sense to them, then you're less likely to have any issues with income. And so that's how they approach that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go through closing costs. I am not going to read you this entire bullet point list. I just want you to get a sense of what where closing costs come from and how quickly they add up. So on top of your down payment, you would also need to have savings set aside for your closing costs. You would have to have closing set aside for your cushion if something happens to your house and that you need to fix. And then you would also want to be thinking about those 2 months of mortgage payments. And so all of those things are going to be things that you're going to want to be factoring in when you're looking at how much of a down payment to put down. When we were doing closing costs, we ended up getting a little bit back because they overestimated how much closing costs were going to be. It was only a couple of $100s, if I remember correctly. They try to do that, but every once in a while, it's a little bit over what they estimated, and then you end up paying more at closing to completely pay off this entire bullet point list of fees. Chicago is one of the only areas in the country that requires the buyer to cover the entirety of closing costs. So in other geographic regions, it's typically split between the buyer and the seller in some kind of way, even if it's not 50-50. In Chicago, you cover all of it as the buyer, which makes it extremely difficult for doing that. I'm trying to think if there's anything specific in here. Property tax is really complicated in Chicago as well because they're typically behind in calculating it. And so sometimes you end up paying based on an old number, and you end up owing a little bit later once they actually recalculate. So that can be tricky and complicated. Bessie, anything else that you would add here for closing costs?
I had something and I lost it. So never mind.
We'll just go into the scenario for the next slide. Okay, so here we have an estimated closing cost of $12,000. That is a ballpark estimate for conventional mortgage, and that's about right for what I think I ended up paying. Your lender will give you a more accurate figure. So as part of your mortgage package, they give you a number for how much you need to have for closing costs. It's typically between 2 and 5% of your mortgage loan values. You can also shop around. It's not necessarily that every factor in this is going to be the same with every lender. So lender fees, home insurance, title insurance, those are factors in your closing costs that you have control over. Some of them you don't have any control over, like the taxes, the government fees, the title transfer, all of that stuff that's set and fixed typically by the government, or in our case, the city of Chicago. Did it come to you, Bessie, or no?
Yeah. Another thing that goes into your closing costs that people need to be aware of, because it's a thing that sometimes lenders hide, is points. And so Jessica's lucky her lender didn't do points, mine did. And so what that is that you buy the interest rate down. So they bring down, let's say you have a 7% interest rate and you want it to be 6.5%, you pay as part of your closing costs to bring it down to 6.5%. And that is significant. It's like $1,500 per quarter point or something like that. So one of the things when you're estimating your closing cost, you want to ask your lender if they anticipate that you're going to have to buy down points, because that can dramatically increase your closing cost. That was it.
Okay, well, I'm turning it over to you to talk through the scenario. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Deanna.
Cool. All right, so we have a couple of different scenarios for you here. With the 200, trying to go back to that $260,000 home. And what you can see here is the different payments based on what you do with the down payment and what happens with the interest rate. And so you can see that for a 5% down payment, those interest rates are different here, the two on the left, and then the closing costs are different because the down payment impacts that. I'm sorry, the interest rate also impacts your closing cost. And so for a $260,000 home, a 5% down payment would be $13,000, and your closing cost would be roughly between $10,000, around $10,000 to $11,000. What you see is a $300 difference in your monthly payment just because your interest rate is lower. So right now, interest rates are about 7 to 7.5%. So that 7.1 is closer to what you would get right now. But this is why you hear folks say, like, maybe right now is not a good time for people, because just lowering down to 5% will lower your payments significantly. If I were to purchase, I actually did the math on my home because I bought it when interest rates were low. If I were to purchase the same place right now, I would not be able to afford it just because interest rates have doubled. And so the market ebbs and flows. 5% is a decent payment. It will probably not be 3 and 4% again, like we saw during the pandemic, but 7% is also really high. And so the only way that you can negate that a lot of times is doing a larger down payment to bring down your cost, but a 10% down payment is $26,000, and that makes things a little bit more difficult. The trade-off to this, I will say, is that if you do purchase when there is a 7% interest rate, it pays off if you plan to stay in your home, let's say 10 years. Because at some point during those 10 years, the interest rate will probably go back down and you could refinance. And when you refinance, you have to pay those closing costs again. And so that's why you have to consider this really carefully. And it's not to say don't purchase right now if you can afford it and your family needs it and you think you're going to be there a while. It's just more about making an informed decision that it limits your buying power to have interest rates this high. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about the different types of loans, because this also, everything we just talked about changes according to the loan that you have. And so one of the big things is you'll hear folks talk about is conventional versus FHA and veteran loans. So conventional loans are the most common. They're the standard practice. It's the easiest way to get a loan, basically. Not easy, I'm sorry, that's not the right word. It is the one that you have to jump through less hoops to, let me not say that. Let's just go through it. All right, so for conventional loans, your down payments can be as low as 3%. Obviously, you need to have 20% for PMI, as we just discussed. They can be harder to qualify for because they're more straight to the point. There's no other different loopholes for them, right? And so you typically need to have at least a credit score of 620 and a debt to income ratio under 36%. Your DTI requirement also varies from lender to lender. So some lenders, like my lender, was willing to go as high as 47%. So some lenders really change, and some, if you go to, one of the things I've learned is if you go to Chase Bank, they tend to have some of the strictest requirements. And so that's another reason it pays to kind of know your situation and then shop around. And so conventional loans are the best for people who have a straightforward type of situation where they know they have their down payment, they know they have the good credit, they know they have everything in line. Next slide. So then you have the government-backed loans. And so this is FHA and VA. So in these situations, the government is backing the lender in case you're not able to pay. They will be ultimately responsible to the bank. You're still responsible to the loan, but they do an additional security for you. So with FHA, you have a little bit more flexibility in that you have, you can go as low as 3.5% for your down payment, but your credit score can be as low as 580 if that's the case, or 500 if you have a 10% down payment. Now, FHA do require mortgage insurance, which lasts the entire life of the loan, or 11 years of the loan, depending on the size of your down payment. With a conventional loan, you can get rid of your PMI if your home appraises for more in a couple of years. And so this is best for borrowers that have limited credit scores and limited down payments because it allows you a little bit more flexibility, and FHA will work with down payment assistance programs. Another con that's not listed here is for you to be able to get an FHA loan, your building has to be, or the building or the home if you're going to condo, which a lot of folks do in Chicago because homes are so expensive, has to be eligible for FHA. And they have to go through a certain amount of requirements to do so. So not every home that you look at is eligible for FHA. And so because of that, it can make your home purchasing process a little bit more difficult. And then there's veteran loans, and I will tell you flat out, this is the one I know least about. But typically for these are available for only veterans and current service members and eligible spouses, and don't require a down payment or a mortgage. Next slide. So the reason we go through all of this is because all of this gets you to the point of pre-approval. So when you want to start looking for a home, a couple of months before you start looking, you want to get your pre-approval letter. So typically a pre-approval is a hard inquiry. So they will do a hard credit check. And so your credit will initially drop a couple of points because of that. And they will give you the basic parameters of what they think you are, who you are as a candidate. Oh, I thought Jessica wanted to say something. She just needed to sneeze. Okay. And so they're looking at your DTI, they're looking at your credit, they're looking at your savings, and they will give you your loan type, your projected interest rate, your projected down payment, and your projected monthly payment as part of this letter. And the reason you want it before you start buying for homes is that if you want to put an offer on your home, your pre-approval letter strengthens your application. The Chicago market in particular is extremely competitive, and you will be much more appealing as a buyer if you have your pre-approval, because you are less likely to have issues with the final loan. So the pre-approval does not guarantee that you will get the final loan. You can still be rejected, but it gives you a pretty close, realistic idea of what it is what it's going to look like for you to be able to afford this home. Also keep in mind, I don't think I put this in specifically, but I actually recommend for folks to go through this process about a year before they think that they're going to buy, if possible. Because I've had a lot of friends go through this process only to find out that they cannot afford what they thought they could. Interest rates are much higher than they thought. They did not think they had the candidate, like they thought their profile was much better than what it actually was in reality. I went through it a year before I purchased, and my first round, I didn't qualify for almost anything. And my lender specifically told me what I needed to work on to qualify for the type of home that I wanted to. And so I had an entire year to go through that process. Jessica, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is sometimes it can scare people to go through this process that Bessie was describing, at least a year before you want to buy your house, because it is what's called a hard credit inquiry, which means that it's going to lower your credit score by a few points. But the reality is that if you're not looking to buy anything else, so like a car or take out massive student loans or anything, well, student loans, they probably just give you, but anyway, if you're not looking to do any other kinds of major purchases, your credit score is going to be fine by the time that you need to make those major purchases. So credit is a tool that is supposed to work for you. And one of the things that it can do for you is get you pre-approved for a mortgage. And so the loss of those couple of points is usually worth it unless you're looking to make another major purchase. So again, with the PMI, like it can be psychologically like scary, but to be like, oh my God, I'm going to get a hit of these points on my credit score. But it's worth it because that's the point of the credit score, is to be able to give you that information. So just wanted to add that.
I appreciate that, because I think part of what we're trying to do is normalize this process, because the entire process is really scary and traumatizing, and you get a lot of really shocking news throughout the entire process, and nobody tells you that this is normal. So I almost backed out of my home buying process because they scared, like the projected closing costs, the projected payment, everything was so inflated, they freaked me the hell out. And so, but I didn't know what I was looking at because nobody explained it to me.
And I had people explaining it to me, and I still freaked out and almost pulled out because I was just like, holy crap, I'm doing this huge thing. This is bananas. So yeah, it was a scary process.
It's so scary. And that's why it's just good to just familiarize yourself with all of it. Next slide. All right. And so one of the things is, this is actually the entire loan process is what you see up here, but we knew we wouldn't get through it today. So we got you right up to pre-approval. And I think that is literally first few steps of trying to purchase. And so if people are interested, we're going to gauge interest probably through a survey, is my guess. We will find out if you want to attend a part 2, where we will go through the process of looking for a home, finding out finding a realtor, the offer negotiations, all of that. Do not rely on your realtor to know everything, because they do not, as I've learned. And so that would be a part 2. Next slide. So we have a couple of resources here, and as mentioned on the chat, we will be sending out the PowerPoint and the recording, because we know this is really content heavy. And we also know that a lot of folks may not have the ability to raise or to say 5%. or the closing cost or something. And so we have other resources for folks to make home ownership accessible. So one is NACA, and you can see all of the benefits there and who qualifies for it. And that is a cool resource to check out. Another thing I want to raise is that if you have a lender that you want to work with, most lenders have down payment and closing cost programs that they work with and can vet if you're eligible for them as well. And they will tell you how they work with your loan. So that is also another resource for you. And I'll turn it over to Jessica because she found the rest of the resources.
Thanks, Betsy. The city of Chicago also has different programs for home buyers. One thing that I would advise you to do is if you're doing anything with the city of Chicago, and this is true for home buyers, this is true for anything, is to just always double check, because sometimes their programs have very long waits or are on pause because the demand is so high compared to the ability to actually provide the program. And so that's important just in general with anything City of Chicago related. The City of Chicago does have these housing counseling centers, which provide a home buyer education course. And so, as Betsy said, we're going to really be thinking about what additional workshops we want to do at alternatives. But in the meantime, if you are interested, these organizations, some of which I'm very personally familiar with, they run programs regularly on home buying for different people that are looking for, you can see in this list their counseling services and see if there are pieces of it that are better fits for you, depending on what your needs are. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And then we have NHS, which is a nonprofit in Chicago that supports new home buyers. They are working to create basically mixed income neighborhoods that people choose to live in. And so that is one of my other favorite resources for people to check out around home buying. You can go to the next slide. I think it's just, yeah, these are all of our references. And so when you get the slides, you'll be able to double check us, always check your sources on everything. And so that'll give you a lot more places to start reading and learning. Anything else you want to add, Betsy?
That's it. Questions now.
This might be a really small question, but something I was thinking about from one of the earlier slides was the difference between the fixed rate versus the flexible rate. And it sounded like fixed was the ideal one. Is that right?
So here's what's interesting. I had an adjustable rate for my first home. An adjustable rate is typically lower up front. So if you have reason to believe that you're going to make more later, that's a risk that you want to take if you want to purchase into something right now. But like Jessica said, it moves with the market, and it moves every year, every like 6 months to a year with the market. There's a cap on how much they can change it. For me, it's $200. So that means from 1 year to another, it can go up $200 every year if interest rates keeps going up. So fixed rate is ideal for folks who like stability. Adjustable rate sometimes is the way that folks can afford to get into a home because the interest rates are lower.
So the only way to like edit something like interest rates or things like that on your loan is to refinance, or not to adjust interest rates, but maybe changing from like fixed to adjustable.
Once you've committed to a loan, yes, you would have to refinance to change anything on the terms of your loan. Roosevelt?
Okay, I guess my question would be, so say if you get approved and the home that you find and you really like is a foreclosed home, how will any of this change?
Oh, each bank has its process if it's foreclosed. And foreclosures and short sales tend to be much more complicated and can be sitting out there for like 6 months while you go through the process. So that is up to the bank. Any other questions?
You also said that if you refinance, you have to pay closing costs again. That
It's a new loan on your property.
I did not know that. That's good to know.
Obviously, if you're refinancing, you think that there's a benefit to that. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is if interest rates ever go down from when I purchased my home, then I would look at refinancing. I don't anticipate that conversation in my head for at least another year. So
I don't think interest rates will ever go down past what you currently have, because I know your interest rate.
Yeah.
And the interest rate I have is historically low. You have to do the trade-off of the lower interest rate versus the amount that you pay in closing costs and figure out the savings, if it's worth it to you. Because sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. If you found your forever home, you're going to be there for 30, like my cousin says that you're going to have to drag her off the kitchen when she dies, off the kitchen floor when she dies. She found her forever home. And so like somebody like that, if the trade-off is a couple of $100 a month that she saves because of the interest rate, totally worth it. But if you're going to be moving out, why would you do that?
Yep.
You can get your refi also worked back into your loan. So you don't have to pay them in cash. But the other thing to consider is like, say that you've been in your home for 5 years, interest rates drop, and you want to refi. A lot of times you're basically getting a new 30-year loan. You're not at 25. And so the way loans are structured is that you pay the majority of the interest up front. So every year you pay a little bit more principal. So when you refinance, you're back to square one of paying the interest, not the principal. And so refinancing could be another predatory practice because folks don't know that.
Yeah, it took my parents my mom a very long time to pay off her mortgage, way more than 30 years, because she refinanced quite a bit and didn't know that when she did it.
So would refinancing make your monthly payment lower though, because interest rates are lower?
It makes it lower if interest rates are lower and because it's a new loan. So like depending on how much you've paid, if you've paid 5 years already and you have 25 years left on your loan, but now you take out a 30-year loan again. So now it's spread over 30 years on top of the interest rate being lower.
Okay.
So like that's why the payment can look lower, but you want to also look at the final, because they always have to disclose how much you're paying when you're done paying off over 30 years, they have to disclose how much you actually paid and how much is interest. And you always want to look at that number too to figure out if it's worth it. Because for me, $100, $150 dropped on my cash flow is not going to be worth tacking on tens of thousands of dollars to my loan. It's not going to be worth it. I'd rather just get done paying it.
When you do the hard check on your credit and it drops like a couple of points, what's a couple of points usually?
It's
Or
going to
5.
depend on so many
Yeah.
factors. So when you pull credit, it depends on like, have you taken out a credit card recently? And recently being like the last 6 months, have you, that kind of thing. So it's really hard to say.
One of the workshops we're planning is tips and tricks for building your credit.
Yeah.
It's actually like less about how responsible you are and more about like understanding the rules of building credit. So like I've always had good credit and also had a significant amount of debt. So like things like that. And so it's just, I think that would be more helpful for that workshop. Yeah. To break that down further. Any other questions? I guess we can stop recording. And since we have so many of our folks here, you guys can give us feedback.